A frail young man sat quietly on a rusty bench outside the police station, cradling a cup of coffee in his hands. His pale skin and tired eyes, marked with dark circles, told a story of exhaustion and hardship. The coffee he held wasn't the cheap synthetic kind he was used to, but the real, plant-based brew that only the wealthier citizens could afford. This small luxury had cost him most of his savings, but on this particular day, he decided to treat himself. After all, he believed his life was nearing its end. As he sipped the coffee, his face twisted in displeasure. "Ah, so bitter," he muttered. But he forced himself to take another sip, determined not to waste the money he had spent. Shaking his head, he thought aloud, "I should have bought real meat instead. Who knew coffee could taste so bad?" Despite its bitterness, he hoped it would keep him awake. He slapped his face to fight off the drowsiness and sighed. Tibet, what a ripoff. Finishing the drink, he stood and tossed the cup toward a garbage bin, missing entirely. Rolling his eyes, he picked it up and carefully placed it in the bin. With a slight grin, he crossed the street and entered the police station, ignoring the judgmental stares of passers-by who viewed him as an outcast in his shabby clothes and haggard appearance. Inside, a tired-looking officer frowned at him. "Are you lost, boy?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and dismissive. Sonny, as the young man was called, looked around curiously, noting the armored walls and hidden weapons. Clearing his throat, he replied, No, I'm here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell, as required by the third special directive." The officer's face paled instantly, and he pressed a button on his terminal. "Code black in the lobby! I repeat, code black!" he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Sonny stood there, unaffected, while the officers scrambled into action. The nightmare spell, as Sonny knew, had devastated the world years ago. It started as a strange illness causing fatigue and unnatural sleep, but soon turned deadly. Those affected by the spell sometimes transformed into monsters, spreading chaos. Yet some people, known as the Awakened, survived the trials of the spell, gaining miraculous powers and restoring some semblance of order. But for Sonny, a poor and untrained young man, being chosen by the spell felt more like a death sentence than an opportunity. Soon, he was restrained in a bulky chair in the basement of the police station, surrounded by grim-faced officers armed with rifles. Despite the tension, Sonny struggled to stay awake, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing moment. Finally, a gray-hired policeman entered the room, his stern face revealing years of experience. After checking the restraints, he asked, "What's your name, kid?" "Sunless," Sonny replied, shifting uncomfortably. The policeman raised an eyebrow. "That's a strange name," Sonny explained. "I was born during a solar eclipse. My mom had a poetic soul, I guess." The policeman sighed. "Do you want me to contact your family?" Sonny shook his head. "There's no one. Don't bother." With a serious expression, the policeman began explaining the dangers of the nightmare spell. He warned Sonny that the trial ahead would test him with illusions and monsters. "Remember, they're not real," he said firmly. "You might have to kill them, so think of them as illusions." As the man continued, Sonny grew sleepier, barely processing his words. "Your aspect and attributes will determine your chances," the policeman said. "Combat aspects are common, but if you get a non-combat aspect, don't lose hope. Be smart and survive." Finally, the policeman concluded with a grim reminder. "If you die, a nightmare creature will emerge, and we'll have to deal with it. So, please don't die, Sunless." Despite his exhaustion, Sonny felt a faint sense of gratitude for the man's concern. But as his eyes closed and the world around him faded, one thought lingered in his mind. He had to survive. Then, in the darkness, a faint, familiar voice echoed. Sonny found himself in a strange, vivid dream of a towering mountain. Its sharp, jagged peaks loomed over the rest of the range, cutting into the night sky. The mountain's slopes were lit by a pale, ghostly moon, and a weathered old road clung precariously to its side. On one side of the road was a sheer cliff face, and on the other, an endless black void stretched into nothingness. The howling wind battered the mountain in vain fury. Suddenly, time seemed to reverse. The moon sank below the horizon and the sun raced backward across the sky. Snow rose from the ground, returning to the clouds, and Sunny saw centuries rewind in mere moments. The old road reappeared, stripped of snow, revealing human bones scattered across it. These vanished, replaced by a caravan of slaves moving backward, their chains clinking in the eerie silence. The sight sent shivers down Sunny's spine. Then, a commanding voice echoed in his mind. "Aspirant, welcome to the nightmare spell. Prepare for your first trial." Sunny found himself on the cold, snowy path of the mountain, chained among a line of weary slaves. His feet ached from the frozen ground, and the biting wind cut through his thin tunic. His wrists throbbed, raw and bloodied from the iron shackles. He glanced around at the grim faces of the other slaves, each bearing marks of hardship. Ahead, a broad-shouldered man walked steadily, his back bloodied from lashes. Behind Sunny, a shifty man muttered curses in a language that Sunny didn't know, yet somehow understood. Confused and alarmed, Sunny tried to make sense of the situation. This was far from the typical first nightmare he had read about. Most aspirants began their trials with some advantage, a weapon, allies, or at least a fair chance. But here he was, starting as a powerless slave, struggling to stay upright. Desperate to understand his predicament, Sunny focused on the shimmering runes that appeared before him when he thought of his status. The words filled him with dread. His aspect, a unique power given to aspirants, was labeled as Temple Slave. The description mocked him, calling it useless and unworthy of mention. Anger and despair filled him as he stumbled, causing the shifty man behind him to curse loudly. The broad-shouldered man in front chuckled darkly. "The mountain will kill him by morning," he muttered. "Probably us too, just a bit later." Another voice, calm and intelligent, joined the conversation from further down the chain. This man warned the others not to harm Sunny, pointing out the markings on his skin that revealed he had been born a temple slave. He explained that Sunny might be connected to a forgotten deity, a fact that made the others uneasy. Their conversation was interrupted by a young soldier riding a white horse. His noble appearance contrasted sharply with the harsh surroundings. He stopped and offered Sunny a flask of water, pity evident in his gaze. But before Sunny could drink, an older soldier lashed out with a whip, scarring Sunny's back. The older man scolded the younger soldier harshly, reminding him that slaves were not to be treated as people. The younger soldier lowered his head, ashamed, as the older one rode away. Sunny, despite his pain, burned with quiet anger. He vowed to himself that he would outlive them both, determined to find a way to survive this trial. The young man felt lost in his thoughts for a moment, but he quickly shook off the gloom. He took a deep breath, appreciating the crisp, clean air around him. Such pure air was rare in the real world, where pollution and unpleasant smells were common. Only the wealthy could afford fresh air through expensive systems, but here he could enjoy it freely, though the cold, aching feet and strained body made it less enjoyable. The slave caravan continued its slow climb up the mountain, and more slaves stumbled and fell. Those unable to continue were harshly unchained and thrown off the edge of the path into the abyss below. Watching them fall, he felt a small pang of pity, silently wishing them peace. Despite the grim situation, he kept his spirits up. He had prepared himself mentally for this when he realized his fate with the spell. After all, losing everything had freed him from the constant worries of survival, leaving him oddly calm. His calmness wasn't without reason. He had seen what awaited the caravan, a chilling scene of bones scattered on the ground ahead. He suspected the caravan would be attacked soon, giving him a slim chance of survival. Deciding to use the time wisely, he reviewed the mysterious runes that displayed his status. Among his attributes, he found Expert, which seemed to attract unlikely events, both good and bad. This explained his rare yet seemingly useless abilities. The Mark of Divinity allowed access to sacred places, though it seemed irrelevant now. However, turned out to be more useful than expected, as it let him see clearly in complete darkness. This small advantage gave him a glimmer of hope. The caravan halted when the head soldier ordered a camp to be set up. The slaves collapsed in exhaustion as soldiers herded them into a tight circle for warmth. A large bonfire was lit in the center, while the chained slaves huddled at its edge. The weaker ones, like him, were left shivering on the outermost circle, unable to get closer to the fire. Food and water were distributed, a meager portion of moldy bread and icy water. Though unappetizing, he forced himself to eat, as did the others. A nearby slave, frustrated with the poor rations, muttered angrily about the cruel treatment. His eyes fell on some red berries growing near the snowy edge. Crawling toward them, he was stopped by a warning from an older, scholarly-looking slave. The older man explained that the berries, called bloodbane, grew where human blood was spilled. While they appeared harmless, they were deadly poisonous. Frustrated, the desperate man cursed under his breath and backed away. The young man paid little attention to their exchange, as his focus shifted elsewhere. He realized the camp's location matched the place he had seen earlier in his vision, where bones were buried under the snow. A sense of dread settled over him, knowing danger was near. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above. His heart raced as something enormous fell from the sky, heading straight for the camp. The slaves stood frozen, their eyes widening in terror as the sky seemed to rain down destruction. Massive shards of ice and heavy stones plummeted from above, crashing into the ground with terrifying force. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams filled the air as people panicked, stumbling and falling, their chains dragging others down with them. The once orderly group became a scene of disarray and fear. Amid the turmoil, one person remained calm. Unlike the others, he had expected something like this. His sharp eyes scanned the dark sky, his mind calculating his next move. Taking a single step back, he narrowly avoided a massive chunk of ice that shattered upon impact, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. While he managed to avoid injury, many others weren't as lucky. The deadly rain left people wounded, some fatally, and their agonized cries echoed all around. "Get to the wall!" a harsh voice barked. It was the same soldier who had whipped him earlier, now trying desperately to restore order. But before anyone could respond, a tremendous crash shook the ground. Something massive had landed between the group and the mountain wall. Silence followed for a moment, broken only by the sound of shifting stones. Everyone's eyes turned toward the creature. At first glance, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, but as it rose, its true form became clear. Towering over the group, it was a horrifying beast, at least 4 meters tall. Its yellowish-gray fur was thick and matted, its long limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face, with 5 pale, insect-like eyes, displayed no emotion, and its maw dripped with thick, slimy drool. What disturbed him the most were the shapes wriggling beneath the creature's skin, moving as if alive.